African Wars. Africa. If you grew up in America and received a standard American education like I did, you might know it as a continent that Europe divided in the 1800s, and beyond that, not much else. But that's okay. American textbooks tend to gloss over the dark continent and its fascinating cultures, languages, and history. Today we'll be looking at just a tidbit of that history, with a relatively recent conflict that sparked one of the greatest names of all time, the Toyota War. Now, what has come to be called the Toyota War is just one conflict in a much bigger series of conflicts, and it involves everyone's favorite African dictator. No, not Idi Amin, not Masi Nuema Bioga Negadong either. We'll get to his craziness in a future video. Today, we'll talk about Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, no matter which way you spell his name. Now known, at least in America, as an eccentric, crazy dictator who died in a drainage pipe, Muammar Gaddafi used to be a wealthy, charismatic man who championed Libyan nationalism, before the whole civil war thing happened. One component of his nationalist plan was to throw out the shackles of European colonialism and foreign domination. Gaddafi did this by consolidating his country's control over its vast oil reserves, and also by sparking conflict in the country of Chad, in a place called the Aouzou Strip. The Aouzou Strip, located in the Borko Anedi Tibesti region of Chad, is immense. Covering more than 44,000 square miles, the area is bigger than the U.S. state of Virginia. However, despite its vast size, its terrain is almost entirely sand, gravel, and rock. Home to only a few thousand people even today, most of whom are concentrated in a village of Aouzou, this strip of land seems rather inconsequential and unimportant. So why did Gaddafi care so much about it? Well, there were rumored to be uranium deposits in the area. Access to uranium would presumably be high on dictators' lists, at least if it was a cheesy action movie. But more importantly, Gaddafi sought to establish a socialist client state based off his Jamahiriya concept that would help to expunge the French from Africa and expand his influence in Chad. Gaddafi called on an unratified treaty signed by France and Italy in 1935 to support his claim to the area. This wasn't the first time Libya had claimed the area either. King Idris I had attempted an invasion in 1954, but was ultimately repulsed by the French, as Chad was still a French colony at the time. Gaddafi was determined to have the Aouzou Strip. Now, in an effort to focus on the Toyota War itself, we'll gloss over most of the following conflict. A video in full detail will be rather long. Even my original script summarizing the entire conflict ran on and on. Essentially, upon taking power in 1969, Gaddafi backed anti-Chadian rebel group Frolinat, training, arming, and funding them. In response, President Francois Tombabale encouraged militias to rebel against Libya, clearly a very rocky start to this conflict. Eventually, relations deteriorated enough that all diplomacy between both countries was shut down in 1971, particularly because a Libyan-backed coup failed to overthrow Tombabale. After this move, Gaddafi only recognized Frolinat as a legitimate Chadian government. Despite these events, diplomatic relations resumed in April 1972, partially due to external pressure placed on both countries, and surprisingly things went rather smoothly. Chad traded the territory of the Aouzou Strip in exchange for £40 million, and Gaddafi withdrew his support of Frolinat. Libyan troops entered the Strip with no resistance and established an airfield there. But of course, if things were to stay this way, we wouldn't have this video. On April 13, 1975, Felix Maloum and parts of the Chadian army murdered Tombabale, angered by his dictatorial policies and appeasement of Libya. Subsequently, they took over the reins of the government. Angered by this change of events, Gaddafi once again recognized Frolinat and escalated his support, gifting them an unprecedented amount of arms and even plotting an assassination attempt on Maloum. This attempt failed. Libya didn't have much luck interfering in Chadian affairs. Skipping a whole lot of backstory, alliances, and battles, Libya fought 4 separate campaigns against Chad in 1978, 1979, 1980 to 1981, and finally 1983 to 1987. The front consistently changed, as did the amount of Libyan involvement in the country, the amount of Libyan troops who controlled Chad, and who the anti-Chadian rebels were. Chad had never really been the victors of these conflicts, but Libya never really was either, especially when the French chose to intervene. This lack of consensus on who won and who lost often contributes to a war lasting longer than you might think they should. The year is now 1987. If you paid attention, you'll realize this is the last year of the Chadian-Libyan conflict. Hissine Habre, once leader of an anti-Libyan rebel group, is the president of Chad. The northern half of his country had been de facto partitioned since 1983. Northern Chad was under the control by the Transitional Government of National Unity, headed by Gokuni Owedi, and backed by Libyan forces, and the Libyan forces were immense. There were 8,000 men, 300 tanks, 60 combat aircraft, helicopters, artillery, rocket artillery, you name it. And although this force was intimidating, it was weakened by a lack of unified command, not to mention disorganization due to Gaddafi's fear of a coup and loss of allies in the region. Morale was at an all-time low for the Libyan forces, but in Chad it was at an all-time high. 10,000 men, led by great commanders, were eager to take back their homeland from a foreign dictator. The French Air Force would assume complete command of the skies if they attacked Libya. Not only that, but France also supplied them with 400 Toyota pickup trucks outfitted with anti-tank guided missile launchers, earning the conflict its name of the Toyota War. The first assault against Libya would come on January 2nd at the bastion located at the village of Fada. A communications hub, Libya had fortified the area well, but the Chadian army had supreme knowledge of the terrain and mobility. The Chadian army encircled the fortified town and completely devastated the Libyan forces defending it. Of the approximately 1,500 Libyan and rebel troops at Fada, nearly 800 were killed with 80 more captured. 92 tanks and 33 armored vehicles were destroyed, with 13 and 18 more respectively being captured. Chad had mobilized 3,000 men into the battle and only lost 50. 3 Chadian trucks were also destroyed, but these losses were nothing compared to the decimation of the Libyan forces. Infuriated and shocked, Gaddafi ordered the bombing of Arada. This village fell way below the 16th parallel, an agreed-upon demarcation line in the conflict, and France retaliated by crippling Libyan radar systems in an airstrike on Wadi Doum. This left the Libyan Air Force blind for the rest of the war. Gaddafi rushed units into Chad, ultimately totaling 11,000 men in the region. Wadi Doum would go on to fall to the Chadian forces in March. The strategic airbase was armed to the teeth? I don't know what you would say. Minefields littered the surrounding area, and tanks and armored vehicles regularly patrolled the base. 5,000 Libyan soldiers stationed there, as well as the aircraft stationed there, seemed to make victory for Chad impossible. But Chad proved it was possible, and actually quite quickly overran the airbase, thanks in part to those trusty Toyota pickup trucks mounted with machine guns and anti-tank missile launchers. Fleeing Libyans were killed either by the Chadians or by their own landmines, and Libyan aircraft strafed the airbase to prevent the capture of Libyan tech and equipment. These efforts were in vain, as Chad captured vast amounts of abandoned military vehicles. Libya seemed doomed. They had lost the majority of their rebel allies, as well as their main airbase. They were practically blind as far as aerial combat went, and they were isolated in a hostile foreign country. More than 3,000 Libyan troops had been killed, captured, or deserted. Gaddafi ordered the withdrawal of the Libyan garrison at Faya Lagao, the main base of Libya's operations, for 4 years. Gaddafi covered up the retreat at home as a victory. Libya was merely withdrawing, so the rebel operations could continue their assault on Habre on their own. This couldn't be further from the truth. Hostilities died down for a few months, but began anew in August the same year. Confident in their previous victories, the Chadian army charged into the Aouzou Strip, hoping to end this war once and for all. Chadian forces occupied the town of Aouzou, prompting Libya to increase air bombardments in the north. France refused to aid the Chadians this time, however, as they sought international mediation over the conflict. Libyan forces managed to overwhelm the Aouzou garrison and retook the town in late August. Would this be a turn of luck for Libya? Chad, after all, had lost its overwhelming French air support, and it was reeling from Libyan bombardments. Libya had learned to adapt to desert warfare, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? Almost the entirety of Libya is desert, and they were unskilled at warfare actually taking place in the desert. And Gaddafi invited journalists from around the world to document his victory. Could Libya once again retain control over Chad? Hissine Habre wouldn't accept defeat, and neither would his army or its commanders. On September 5th, a surprise raid struck 60 miles into Libyan territory, aiming at the Matan al-Sawra airbase. 2,000 Chadians faced 2,500 Libyans. Despite the extensive fortifications, tanks, and aircrafts the Libyans possessed, the raid was an overwhelming success for the Chadians. Losing only 65 men of their own, Chad killed more than 1,000 Libyans, not to mention the extensive amount of vehicles and equipment they destroyed. The raid was a stroke of genius for Chadian commander Hassan Jamous. His troops followed the wadis, or valleys of the region, to avoid being exposed, and successfully confused the Libyans by maneuvering to the north and northwest, then bearing to the east toward Matan al-Sawra. The Libyan forces were under the thought that the Chadians were in fact Libyan reinforcements, and attempted to join with them. Having killed more than half the garrison and taken hundreds of Libyans captive, Chad demolished any military equipment they could not carry, as well as Libyan aircraft and tanks, and tore up the runways. Traveling completely without light, guided only by the moon and stars in a nighttime sky, Chadian forces safely retreated back behind their own borders. The Chadian government declared the battle must be written in gold letters in the Great Book of Victories. This victory forced Libya to the negotiating table, and a ceasefire was arranged by the Organization of African Unity on September 11th. Gaddafi had been weakened by the victory, but so had Habre. France feared that the raid was just a stepping stone to an all-out Chadian invasion of Libya, and declared any such move was one they would not tolerate. Habre, too, was forced to negotiate. The casualties were enormous. Libya and its rebel allies had lost nearly 7,500 men, not to mention 800 tanks and armored personnel carriers and 28 aircraft. The Chadians suffered 1,000 killed. The following year, Gaddafi recognized Habre as a president of Chad, calling the move a gift to Africa. In October 1988, diplomatic relations resumed, and the two countries agreed for the International Court of Justice to intervene in 1990. 4 years later, the court ruled the Aouzou Strip belonged to Chad, bringing an end to a 4-decade-long debate over the region. Chad had finally won the Aouzou back, and it was all thanks to a bit of military genius and some Toyota pickup trucks.